All right, welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about what Bootstrap is, how it works, and show you some examples. So let's start with that first thing. What is Bootstrap? According to the Bootstrap documentation, it helps you build responsive, mobile-first projects on the web with the world's most popular front-end component library. So they call it a front-end component library. Also, people will refer to it as a front-end framework, as a CSS framework. There's some different terminology around it. At the end of the day, what it really is a single CSS file and a single JavaScript file that you include into your own HTML documents. And that's it. And those two files together, which are extremely long, and technically behind the scenes, they're like 50 files that get compiled into a single file. But anyway, those two files give us a ton of features, a lot of functionality, a lot of styles, it opens a whole new world for us. But it's not like we just add those two files and we're done. What we do is we then go into our HTML markup and we add classes into our elements. So when we use Bootstrap, we add the two files in, and then our HTML looks like this, something like this at least, where we have a ton of classes. And these are Bootstrap specific classes, things like container, display1, text center, jumbotron. These are just a couple examples. There are hundreds and hundreds of these classes that we could add in. That's really what this course is about. The majority of this course is adding classes into our HTML without having to write any CSS. So let me show you an example. Here's a website that's built with Bootstrap, and we're going to come back to this and make this later on. But there's a lot of stuff going on. We have buttons, we have this carousel, we have this grid of images. There's a nav bar up here. It's responsive, it collapses down. But what I want to show you is what the markup itself looks like. If you look at our markup, it's a ton of class equals something. Class equals all of this stuff over here, container, text center, column medium 4, p-3. Kind of looks like gibberish sometimes, but it all makes sense after you learn how it works. That's a very stupid sentence. What I want to show you though is if we remove Bootstrap, so this is the file that I'm going to, in a single line, basically eliminate all of Bootstrap. My markup is exactly the same. I didn't change any of that. I severed the connection to Bootstrap. This is what the website looks like now. So all the content is here. It's just totally out of control, hideous, no styles for the most part. The nav bar is gone. So all of that stuff came from Bootstrap. So my markup hasn't changed. All these classes are here. They just don't do anything anymore. Those all come from Bootstrap. So we'll add it back in and hold our breath. Everything's right again in our world. All right, so let's talk about what Bootstrap actually gives us. There's really three things that we get in Bootstrap. The first and most important, I shouldn't say most important, but the most flashy thing are the components we get. So there are dozens and dozens of pre-built components, things like buttons. So this is a Bootstrap button. This here is altered technically, but this is a Bootstrap button. We also get things like forms. So the default forms in your browser aren't very pretty. These are Bootstrap forms. They look nicer. Nav bars. This is a really big one. It's a huge pain to make nav bars on your own that are responsive. Notice this nav bar up here. It's transparent. We shrink it down. It's responsive. It collapses into this drop down. So those are things we get from Bootstrap. Those are components. We see them. There are things that go on the page, and there's dozens of them. But then there's also this thing called the grid system. And for a lot of people, this is actually the most important, the most useful thing. The grid system doesn't look like much on its own, but what it does is it allows us to lay out content extremely easily. It's really, really nice. Some people only use Bootstrap for the grid system. So here's an example. We have content on one section of that website I showed you, and there's a bunch of images. We can have it go from 4 images across on a large size to 2 images across on a mobile size. Or we could say go to 1 image across all in a column. There's so many different things we can do. Let me just show you an example here. This is the Bootstrap documentation. Don't worry about the content on the page or the words. That's not what I'm showing you. What I want to show you is the layout. So over here we have something on the right, this little sidebar, our main content, and then another sidebar on the left. And notice what happens as I shrink the page down. The layout is going to change. Right about here, that right sidebar disappears entirely. So that's done using the grid system. Same thing here on the left. We have this nav bar, and there is space allocated for it, this sidebar, and then space for our main content. And it goes away at some point, and now we have a totally different layout. Now it doesn't disappear entirely, it goes into this up here, but my point is that we can change the layout of content using the grid system. So on its own, there's nothing to look at with the grid. It's a bunch of markup, it's kind of ugly, it involves a bunch of class names like this, column medium 6, column large 4, but they all dictate how content is laid out. So you can see these two things right here totally change. Now they stack and they go all the way across. Here they're splitting the screen 50-50. So far we've talked about components that we get. There's the grid system, and then last but not least, there are utilities. In Bootstrap 4, there are a bunch of these new utilities that help us do really common operations in CSS. And it's surprisingly useful. I didn't think I was that excited about them, or I wasn't excited about them, but then I started using them and they're really nice. So there are a bunch of classes we can add in to add padding or margin or borders or spacing, all sorts of different properties, little shortcuts so that we don't have to write a bunch of extra CSS. So these are things that, I mean, they're called utilities, so they're not like these full-fledged components. It's not going to make you a button or make you a nav bar, but it allows you to tweak things really easily. Anyway, we'll spend a lot of time on that, but just to show you one example, let's say that I wanted to add padding to this button, padding on the top and bottom. Usually I would have to go into my CSS and write, select this button and write my padding, and it's a couple of lines of code. It's in a different file. But with Bootstrap's new utilities, I can go to the button, which is right here, and say padding Y5. Now don't worry about what that actually means, but I'm going to save, and you'll see I just added a bunch of padding. I just changed that button with this simple class name. So this is one of those utilities we're going to talk about. There are many utilities, super useful stuff, but don't worry about it just yet. I just wanted to show you that it exists. So let's recap this video. Bootstrap is a library, a framework, a component library that basically is just two files, a CSS file and a JavaScript file. You put them into your own HTML document, and then on its own, that does a little bit, but what we usually do is incorporate a bunch of classes into our markup. We pick and choose, and we say, make this a Bootstrap button, make this a Bootstrap navbar, use the grid system here, use the utilities for padding here, and it all happens in the class portion of an element. So we add multiple classes to elements often. And the things that we get from Bootstrap are components, buttons, forms, navbars, many others, the grid system to help lay our content out, and then utilities to help us manipulate content that's on the page, things like padding and margin and border. Awesome. Next up, I want to talk about why you would use Bootstrap, but also why you might not want to use Bootstrap. What are popular criticisms? Do all Bootstrap websites look the same? So that's up next.